Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, April 27th, 2019. I'm Bob Diebold, the Vice Chairman for the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today continues Phase 3 with webinar number 12 in the series of webinars on the topic of comparing and contrasting the true teachings of Jesus with the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. This is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Its author and the chairman of the committee is Neil Waldrop, for whom I am turning the facilitation of this webinar over to right now. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. I am once again delighted to be with you. I have a mechanical question that I need to address to Bob first before we get going. Right now, I'm still seeing the display of all four of us at once. Have you shifted to the individual view on the program, Bob?
That's right. We've got speaker view working. When this plays back, you'll just see individual speakers. Each of our panelists can display gallery or speaker view as they wish.
Thank you. For our viewers, I should explain that we decided that it's better for you, the viewer, to have an image of just the person speaking, then you are not distracted by the faces of others participating. In any case, please let me welcome you to this broadcast. We are indeed continuing our examination of topic 8 of Revelation Revealed. I would say to any of the viewers who may not have that document, Revelation Revealed, to hand, that it would be very helpful to you. It would help you understand our discussion much better if you were to download it from the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor, which is as follows: www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. The word global endeavor is treated as a single word without any space or punctuation in the middle. The link to the document Revelation Revealed is near the bottom of the homepage. In addition, because viewers who are watching this program on YouTube do not have any opportunity to ask us questions while we are conducting it, we offer you the option of sending in a question, or more than one if you wish, by sending an email message to the address identified at the bottom of the homepage of the website for the Committee for the Global Endeavor, and that is as follows: info@globalendeavor.net. Your question would be best addressed to some aspect of what we have been talking about, or possibly an idea of yours that arises because of the discussion. If we decide to use your question, we reserve the right to edit it to suit our program, and we would then refer to it during a subsequent broadcast to the effect that all the panelists would talk about your question. You would not be getting an answer solely from me. So now I will start the discussion of the content of our program today. We are going to start at the top of page 104 of Revelation Revealed. This succeeds a page, namely page 103, which discussed the question, the topic of theology, its advantages and disadvantages. And now the initial paragraphs at the top of page 104 in effect amount to a transition, saying that we are going to move away from the generalized discussion of philosophy as a principle, but that there is one topic of a theological nature that we do need to cover. So the first 4 paragraphs on page 104 amount to this kind of explanatory transition, and I will proceed to read them now. In view of the rather pointed remarks cited above, and given the not entirely pleasant aftertaste of the various Christian doctrines and dogmas that we have already examined, it would be reasonable to nourish the hope that we can move aside, that we can now turn in different directions, accelerating well away from all this and consigning it to the rearview mirror. Unfortunately, however, there remains one more aspect of Christian theology that we cannot evade or neglect. Examining it will enable us to acquire the knowledge and understanding that we would need in order to repulse a potentially vicious attack on the teachings of the Urantia book, an attack featuring intellectual aggression that would amount to name-calling. Here is the essential issue. How would you respond if a theologian or some other aficionado of Christian doctrine and history were to assert that the Urantia book is, quote, Pelagian, unquote, on the understanding that he or she intended that epithet as a badge of opprobrium, ignominy, and shame, and was wielding it as an all too convenient excuse that dispensed him or her from making the effort to analyze the teachings in substance and discuss them in detail? Some of you might surprise me by tossing off an answer now, but I assure the rest of you that I shall repeat the question after I have done my best to provide sufficient background. As a practical matter, this story takes us to the final decades of the 4th century and to the first few decades of the 5th, well after Constantine had designated Christianity as the state religion of the Roman Empire, a step that he took in the year 313 CE or shortly thereafter. That is not entirely accurate. Constantine began favoring and subsidizing Christianity in the year stated, 313 CE. Now we go to the heading called Pelagius and Augustine, and I wonder, Charles, if you would be willing to read the 2 paragraphs at the bottom of page 104 that follow that heading.
Yes, Pelagius and Augustine, one of the intense theological controversies of that era, although certainly not the only one, pitted Pelagius, a relatively obscure British monk who was then preaching in Rome, against Augustine, Bishop of Hippo in North Africa, an ecclesiastical superstar whose extant works in Latin have made him the most prolific author who ever wrote in that language, and not incidentally the most influential theologian who lived and taught in Western Europe during Christianity's first few centuries. This brief account of the protagonists will undoubtedly enable a perceptive reader to infer who won the argument, but the underlying contention will not be clear unless I provide reasonably detailed information about Pelagius and Pelagianism, teachings named after him. With that goal in mind, I shall start by reproducing 2 articles from the current edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, an edition available solely in the form of computer software.
Thank you, Charles. At the end of our webinar last week, I gave a brief introduction to this story, and I would like to repeat just a little bit of that introduction. In addition to being the most prominent theologian in the western half of Christianity in the early centuries, Augustine had character traits, a personal background, a family background that clearly identified him as Roman. These character traits involved a respect for authority and hierarchy and uniformity. They led him to emphasize the role of the organized institutional church, its prerogatives, and its power in determining exactly how believers should operate. So with this background, then, we will go on to the next page, where there is an excerpt from Encyclopedia Britannica about Pelagius, and I would ask Bob to read this excerpt, the body of page 105.
Thanks, Neil. Born about 354, probably Britain. Died after 418, possibly Palestine. This is the box that's titled Pelagius. Monk and theologian whose heterodox theological system, known as Pelagianism, QB, emphasized the primacy of human effort in spiritual salvation. Coming to Rome, circa 380, Pelagius, though not a priest, became a highly regarded spiritual director for both clergy and laymen. The rigorous asceticism of his adherents acted as a reproach to the spiritual sloth of many Roman Christians whose moral standards greatly distressed him. He blamed Rome's moral laxity on the doctrine of divine grace that he heard a bishop cite from the Confessions of St. Augustine, who in his prayer for continence beseeched God to grant whatever grace the divine will determined. Pelagius attacked this teaching on the grounds that it imperiled the entire moral law and soon gained a considerable following in Rome. Henceforth, his closest collaborator was a lawyer named Celestius. After the fall of Rome to the Visigoth chieftain Alaric in 410, Pelagius and Celestius went to Africa. There they encountered the hostile criticism of Augustine, who published several denunciatory letters concerning their doctrine, particularly Pelagius's insistence on man's basically good moral nature and on man's own responsibility for voluntarily choosing Christian asceticism for his spiritual advancement. Pelagius left for Palestine, circa about 412. There, although accused of heresy at the Synod of Jerusalem in 415, he succeeded in clearing himself and avoiding censure. In response to further attacks from Augustine and the Latin biblical scholar Jerome, Pelagius wrote De Liberio Arbitrio, which is on free will, translated, in 416, which resulted in the condemnation of his teachings by two African councils. In 417, Pope Innocent I endorsed the condemnations and excommunicated Pelagius and Celestius. Innocent's successor, Zosimus, at first pronounced him innocent on the basis of Pelagius's Libellus Fidei, that's the Latin for a brief statement of faith. But after renewed investigation at the Council of Carthage in 418, Zosimus confirmed the council's 9 canons condemning Pelagius. Nothing more is known of Pelagius after this date. And I'll quote the source here: Pelagius, Encyclopedia Britannica, Chicago, Illinois, 2015. Neil, you're on mute.
Thank you, Bob. The step of muting requires me to unmute. And yes, that's better, because generally if I'm muted, then whatever I happen to be saying is confined to the room in which I'm located. Let's go into the middle of the first paragraph. The idea that Pelagius was offended by Augustine's prayer for grace in order to enable him to behave properly. In effect, the issue was continence. This prayer, at least from Pelagius's point of view, implied that Augustine could not make that decision, could not govern himself, unless God gave him the grace to do it. So by implication, that meant that Augustine's free will was abridged because he relied on God's grace to point him in the right direction. Doreen, why do you think that was unappealing to Pelagius? You're muted too now, excuse me.
Thank you. I believe that took away a lot of responsibility from man to monitor himself, to realize that everything is in God's hands and not his, and that he has also a responsibility to monitor himself and to do God's will, whatever that was, instead of just believing, I guess, which led to the predestination discussion that we'll probably have after. Because if everything was predestined, then what responsibility do they have? So the immorality that he saw when he came through all the hierarchy, and he started perhaps to realize this was not acceptable. And what changes the way people do things? Well, then you have to have self-reflection. You have to realize that you have, that to be, I guess, saved, if that was all that was, entirely within your own grasp and merit. And so everything, that God created had to be good, but those who felt, that evil was real is just an excuse for their lack of willpower, self-control.
Thank you. Charles, let me extend the question slightly. Does this idea of relying on God's grace, in effect, portray God as almost a puppet master pulling strings, that humanity responding to the strings of God, namely grace, would behave in a certain way, whereas without these strings being pulled in heaven, humanity would not be able to change? What do you say about that?
Well, in my view, it's a distortion of God, God's nature and his attributes. First of all, it undermines the concept of God as a loving father or parent. Parents will guide, but not behave, and the good parents don't behave in this manner. And it breaks down the structure of personal responsibility for individuals. I could see where this might be interpreted by many as moral license. That sounds a bit perverse, but human behavior is, in many respects, perverse, and it will take advantage of a permissive environment. It isn't that Augustine wanted to, he didn't assert that, but I think that might be the net effect of many Romans, a number of different classes responding to this teaching.
I agree with you that this is not what Augustine intended, but it did emphasize that God was responsible for providing the grace necessary, and that human beings lacking grace were therefore relieved at least of some of their responsibility for their actions, because by implication, God had not given them enough grace to solve this problem. Now, I admit that that is a simplification of the concept, but it seems to have been the problem that Pelagius was objecting to.
Well, again, it's not Augustine's concept, but a distortion of it. But I think his concept itself is a distortion. And unfortunately, personal responsibility is a casualty of permissive norms. Not that he intended that to be permissive, but I could easily see how the chain of the breakdown of the structure of personal responsibility. We had a dramatic example of that in the 20th century. At the Nuremberg war trials, the captured Nazis who were put on trial did not claim, with one exception I'm aware of, only one exception, claim responsibility for the final solution. And when I read about that and studied it, it occurred to me that perhaps the single biggest ethical issue in modern times is personal responsibility. It's a very serious matter. It goes right to the heart of the foundation of society's stability and its continuity. And in any case, this idea that let's do it in terms of a couple of questions. If you fail morally and or spiritually, does that mean that your prayers were inadequate in the first place, or does it mean that you didn't try hard enough? Does it mean that God had something in mind with you as an individual, even before you were born, before time itself? Where does this put the individual in terms of continuity, security, assurance, and responsibility? In modern democracies, there's a natural tension between rights and responsibilities. And in my opinion today, we live at a time when in this country and some other democracies, there's a heavier emphasis on rights instead of responsibility. And I think it goes to the heart of this issue between Pelagius and Augustine. What happens to the position of the individual morally, at least morally, and later spiritually? Where does it put us? And is it to come down? Do you need special ceremonies in your prayer? Do you need special words? There are all kinds of implications. Do the circumstances, so the place is of importance to have a successful petition, prayerful petition to acquire God's grace so that you can avoid these things? If you wanted to avoid them, many Romans didn't anyway. The Roman baths, for example, had a reputation for being, they had for centuries, for being very lascivious. Jesus avoided them. He didn't make any judgment about them. He didn't comment. But when the Indian father and son, Gaynor and his father, went, he declined to go. I think largely because of the reputation that they held, moral reputation. So this is a serious matter, and one that needs more than theology to settle, seems to me. But theology is an important feature of the debate.
I agree. I would say that the underlying argument is not only about the sufficiency of grace, but about whether God's decision to grant grace or withhold it, and to grant it in certain quantities or not, in effect abbreviates or curtails human free will to the degree of responsibility. Now, Charles, you pointed out that the issue of personal responsibility was a huge matter in the context of the Nuremberg trials, but the implications of Augustine's stance, in effect, put the onus on God to provide the grace and the circumstances that enables right action on the part of individuals, whereas Pelagius appears to have been arguing that the responsibility is the individual's, that the individual does not depend upon a ceremony, does not depend upon the involvement of the church in order to be responsible for his correct moral decisions. Let's move down to the final paragraph of the segment from Encyclopedia Britannica that Bob read, but I would like to recognize Bob first because he's motioned that he would like to comment.
Yeah, I'd just like to pick up on a couple points. One that Doreen brought up that I picked up and caught. It's all about control, I think. Your question to Doreen was, why do you think Pelagius felt this way? And as we've been going through this time period, kind of realizing communication was not what we think it is. The common person couldn't read or write, was pretty much illiterate. Gutenberg didn't come along until another 1,000 years in the 1500s, so there was no mass printing. So the fight for control was to the elite, so to speak, to the Roman nobles. Now, if Augustine, was Roman, I suppose I think as we read further, he was a noble. He may not have been wealthy, but this building of control at the top of the pyramid was certainly essential to those at the top. And how do you do that? Well, you get rid of all your enemies who might cause an issue with the way that you can control. So this idea of philosophically, we can talk a little bit more about this idea of personal responsibility that Charles brought up first. I'll hold that for just a little bit, but the context at the time was very interesting, and maybe it's the beginning perpetuation of the Dark Ages until technology was able to free the humans that were beginning to become a little bit more literate. I also thought of another interesting thought here, and that is deism and theism. These two concepts weren't of God weren't really prominent until about the 18th century, maybe the 17th century. And deism, of course, most of the founders of the Constitution were deists. And the difference with that is that a deist believes that God creates everything and then steps back and lets it happen. And a theist is just the opposite. God creates everything and then provides all of the puppeteering, my terminology, that is necessary. And this idea of arbitrary and capricious grace is one that those at the top of the pyramid who can gain control and who did gain control can then come up with all kinds of reasons for how the normal person could get grace. So I'll just leave it at that because there's more to come with that, obviously. But very interesting topic, and I appreciate being able to spend a little bit more time than I have in the past on trying to understand not only the origins but the history of how all of this progressed and built to today. Over.
Thank you. I would agree with your general approach and confirm also a remark that Doreen made earlier, that this eventually, as a topic, led Augustine to the theories of predestination, which we find repulsive. But let me return now to the segment that you, Bob, read and ask for comment about the implications of the third paragraph. The third paragraph describes a series of appeals to authority, wherein various councils of a local nature and then eventually two popes are mentioned. So what is going on here appears to be a contention for the official approval of a hierarchy, on the understanding that Pelagius accepted the right of the hierarchy to make these decisions and was bound in discipline and obedience to follow those decisions. But the description of the events implies that there was kind of a shopping process. You go to one source of authority and it turns out contrary to what you wanted, then you go to another source of authority, and then finally, at the end, Augustine got the outcome that he wanted. But in all these cases, indeed, it is a process whereby authority on behalf of the organized institutional church takes the step of deciding what people shall be allowed to teach and what teachings shall be considered unauthorized, or indeed, to use the term that was in vogue at the time, quote, heretical, unquote. And those who were determined to be heretical were in deep trouble. At a later stage in the history of Christianity, that verdict might cause one to be burned at the stake, and it did. Whereas in Pelagius's day, the decision by the Pope of the time that his teachings were heretical did not cause him to be put to death. But nevertheless, the peril was there as a consequence of the principle of authority maintained by the hierarchy of the church at the time. So now finally to the question that I would like to ask you, Bob. Why was the authority of the various church leaders and councils accepted as a constraint on what one could teach, on what one could believe?
I'm not sure I understand the question, Neil. Could you kind of rephrase it a little differently? It's a why question.
Why? Yes, why did Christian believers, why did monks, why did priests, why did bishops agree that there was a hierarchy of authority that could tell them what to teach and tell them what not to teach?
Right. Okay. Well, I think if we go back to where this all originated, go back to Constantine, and the fact that the church and the state were synonymous with each other, and I think we can see that the church, I'll put that in quotation marks here for this period of time, is gaining authority to be able to do what the original intent was, and that's to settle the empire, to stop all of this chaos going about. Ideas that are different could create a messy chaos. We were nowhere close to democracy, of course, in 400 AD. So I think that generally speaking, I think that's the basis of the of the why. And then as as I brought up just a minute ago, it seems to me that this idea of once I get there, once I firmly establish myself, with the state, so to speak, I'm speaking in general terms here, of course, I'm in control. I control the ideas. I control society at this point because society is communicated by verbal only, and by disseminating this common system, belief system, they can control what the individual should and shouldn't think by force of fear, by force of anything that they want, as a matter of fact. And that's I suppose if we look towards the the next 900 year or 600 years, and the Spanish Inquisition is probably the denouement of all of this stuff. So that's my first thought about that, right off the top. Back over.
Thank you, Charles. I would like to continue on the general thought that Bob has given us and ask you to reflect on the overall cultural and intellectual situation resulting from the fact that in this period, the 4th and 5th centuries, and even until we reach modern times, starting approximately with the Reformation, the organized institutional church had a monopoly on education. There were no public schools. As Bob pointed out earlier, written texts were scarce because printing had not yet been developed. And those who were educated were those who had been formally accorded authority by the church. So do you believe that this premise of ecclesiastical rulings over what was permissible and what was not as a matter of doctrine and teaching was reinforced, or for perhaps the lack of a better term, almost made inevitable because of the monopoly of the church in regard to education?
Are you asking me?
I indeed am.
Well, there are a number of, using a historian's term, lines of force involved. Church authority seems to have mimicked, in many respects, the character of Roman authority in its origins, in its earlier development, sooner or later. I mean, it picked the city of Rome, which was the capital of the Roman Empire. I don't know whether that was inevitable or not, but it's not a coincidence. I'm sure it's not a coincidence. With regard to what we would call education today, or reading, the ability to read, very few people, there were very few Bibles. Bob is correct. There were very few people who had them and very few people who could read them. The most common book circulated for hundreds of years were books of hours. They were prayer books in the European Middle Ages. The clergy, for example, many rulers couldn't read. Many princes and princesses could not read. Charlemagne was illiterate. He had books. He was buried with books because his body was open. The coffin was opened up, but he couldn't read. Books did convey a certain legitimacy of authority, as well as being that authority. If you can read and someone else can't, they're entirely dependent on you. The integrity of what you say, what you represent, as the meaning, the content and meaning of what is read. Bible being the central book, the core volume of European Christianity, was therefore very, I'm not, maybe the word mysterious. I imagine I've known people who were illiterate, and not very many, but I've known a few personally. To them, writing was something of a mystery. But these people in a more modern context, I imagine it was mysterious to many people. And mystery is a great way to maintain influence over people. If you're the source and the object of that mystery, and reading was. The Bob's generalizations, as far as I know in the history of the Bible, are quite accurate. Authority itself is often tantamount to power. They go hand in hand. I'm talking about that power. Lord Acton once made a statement that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think that was at play here to a degree. Because if you were a Christian cleric, even on a low level, even a priest who could hardly read, if at all, you were able to identify with a hierarchy of authority that had tremendous power and mystery, and had a direct line, supposedly, to God himself vis-a-vis the effort to acquire grace. Augustine was in many ways preaching to the choir of human nature. There's a reason why tyrants, this is very important, there's a reason why tyrants burn books or execute people or excommunicate or shoot people or behead them or burn them at the stake or put them in more modern terms in concentration camps who don't conform. And had Pelagius remained where he was, he may have ultimately met death. We don't know, but I would imagine he had to get up and move periodically from time to time for his safety and perhaps even some peace of mind. There's a deeper issue, however, in all this, in that paragraph that's raised. It's the chosen person syndrome. When the chosen person syndrome or the chosen group or people syndrome is put into play, that exacts from others, from followers, loyalty and identity. You must identify with it. That is, you place your sense of self in a primal way under this larger structure. So you identify with it. And the benefit is that you, in conforming and being more uniform, is that you're safe in the context of such an arrangement. You are edified, you're elevated vicariously. And you're expected not only to give your identity, but your loyalty to that identity. And the chosen person syndrome is something of an intoxication. It can be an intoxicating thing, because you have the power and the mystery to define and shape and initiate programs and things, and it's you who determines what's of value and what is not. It's you who determines what is right and what is wrong. It is you who determines what is good and what is bad for people. That's a tremendous power. And again, it's no coincidence. Hitler dramatized the burning of books, but there was a Chinese emperor who did that. The Buddhist texts destroyed them. And destroyed not hundreds, but thousands of Buddhist temples. There's this kind of behavior is very human. So the great danger in the chosen person syndrome, in the hierarchy, and specifically in the Christian structure of authority and power and mystery, is that the notion that it can and does form a stand-in for God is very close. It's very close at hand. It isn't much of a move to go from being a facilitator to a decider for the fate of others, F-A-T-E. And it is dangerous, very dangerous.
Charles, I agree with what you have said. What I would like you to specifically to do is to comment on the relationship between these ideas of chosen people and hierarchy and authority with the other idea of monopoly. We think of monopoly as an economic matter, and indeed that's the context in which we normally find it. But my point and my wish to address a question to you is predicated on the idea of intellectual monopoly. The church was the sole source of learning, the sole source of education, the sole source of authority about doctrine. And so the hierarchy involved in the church and the authority involved in its bishops and so on, the Pope, was linked with its monopoly over ideas. Now, does that seem even more threatening than what you've described before?
Well, it's essentially the same thing. It abrogates personal responsibility to one degree or other. Monopoly, anything can be a monopoly, any subject. And intellectual monopoly it can become totalitarian. So an intellectual monopoly can, I would argue, can degenerate morally, ethically, and even spiritually into making certain thoughts as expressed in opinions, crimes. And that's why people were burned alive, because thought itself had been made into a crime. And Christianity later in the Middle Ages would, not just in Spain, the Inquisition was was all over Christendom in many, many areas. William Tyndale in the year 1542 was burned alive at the stake publicly in broad daylight because he had the audacity to translate the Latin New Testament into English. That was his crime. That's a thought crime, to use Orwell's term. It's a thought crime, and that's what ultimately an intellectual monopoly can degenerate into. That's the grave danger to it, and it then stifles the mind. It makes prisoners of them through their minds. And I suspect it's hard to imagine, aside from the iniquity of sin, it's hard to imagine a slavery that's greater.
Thank you. I think we've done a reasonable job on the excerpt from Encyclopedia Britannica that Bob read. I'd like now to turn the page and reach the second excerpt, likewise from Encyclopedia Britannica. This excerpt is headed Pelagianism, and I wonder if indeed Doreen is prepared to read those 3 paragraphs in the box labeled Pelagianism for us.
Sure. A 5th century Christian heresy taught by Pelagius, QV, and his followers that stressed the essential goodness of human nature and the freedom of the human will. Pelagius was concerned about the slack moral standards among Christians, and he hoped to improve their conduct by his teachings. Rejecting the arguments of those who claim that they sin because of human weakness, he insisted that God made human beings free to choose between good and evil, and that sin is a voluntary act committed by a person against God's law. Celestius, a disciple of Pelagius, denied the church's doctrine of original sin and the necessity of infant baptism. Pelagianism was opposed by Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, who asserted that human beings could not attain righteousness by their own efforts and were totally dependent upon the grace of God. Condemned by 2 councils of African bishops in 416 and again at Carthage in 418, Pelagius and Celestius were finally excommunicated in 418. Pelagius's later fate is unknown. The controversy, however, was not over. Julian of Eclanum continued to assert the Pelagian view and engaged Augustine in literary polemic until the latter's death in 430. Julian himself was finally condemned with the rest of the Pelagian party at the Council of Ephesus in 431. Another heresy known as semi-Pelagianism, QV, flourished in southern Gaul until it was finally condemned at the Second Council of Orange in 529. The source, of course, is Pelagianism, Encyclopedia Britannica. Anyway, 2015.
Thank you. For our purposes, I think there are two phrases that establish the net context which involved a contradiction. In the first paragraph, the statement that Pelagius, insisted that God made human beings free to choose between good and evil, whereas in the second paragraph, that Augustine asserted that human beings could not attain righteousness by their own efforts and were totally dependent upon the grace of God. Now, the latter, totally dependent, implicitly asserts the validity of human free will, or at least its ability to make choices. It comes close to the idea of being a marionette or a puppet in the comparison that we used earlier. Why do you think, Bob, Augustine asserted that human beings are totally dependent upon God's grace?
Well, I go back to a point that Charles made, I think, Neil, and that is he made the point about when you have control for standing in for God, you are no longer a facilitator, you're a decider. I hope I got that right, Charles. I did write it down.
Yes.
Thank you. I think that's really key here. Go back to my idea of, the top of the pyramid, so to speak. If I control the top of the pyramid for ideas and the context of the time, or the social aspect of civilization at the time, pretty much allowed the top of the pyramid to disseminate whatever they wanted to at the time, as long as I can control the narrative. If the late Howard Zinn used to say, if you can control history, you can control the future, and I think that's probably something that Augustine and those that with Augustine, we're talking about Augustine in generalities for the rest of the bishops who would take sides with him, and then they had the ability to be able to in both of these readings, and the one that I read and the one that Doreen just read, there was some pretty severe penalties for excommunication, condemning. So if you have a group that's in power and can do this excommunication, so to speak. I'm not sure exactly what that meant in those times, but you definitely have the ability to become not only the decider, but you can facilitate whatever you want, and then comes this idea that once I control the narrative, I can control society pretty much. And I think if we then follow history going forward, it took probably another 600 or 700 years before society had the technology to be able to say enough of this stuff. And I'm sure that we'll see about Luther and Calvin, although maybe they really didn't change the situation in degree only and not in kind. So hope that answered what the start was. I'll throw it back to the group.
Well, I'd like to pursue you slightly.
Okay.
I commented earlier that Augustine, a noble Roman, had Roman attitudes toward authority. And we discussed my essay, Romanita, in which, as I pointed out, this Roman authority eventually led to the union of church and state. So now if Augustine emphasized authority, hierarchy, and uniformity, how would he react to the concept of concern that we express about, in effect, tyranny, whereby the government and the religion are the same, or so closely linked to be functionally the same, and exercising tyrannical authority over thinking and belief? How would he react to that?
Well, obviously, he would react to that in ways that we would see in the 12th and 13th century. The ability to be able to be joined at the hip with church and state now. Now you've got not only the material, but you've also got the spiritual. You've got the whole human being now, and you've effectively got society to where you can decide, you being those in power can actually effectively make society what they wish. Surreptitious, conspiratorial, maybe. It almost smacks of once the bishops decided that they were going to be on the right side and not be excommunicated. You can see how the system then builds upon itself, and it's one of these vicious cycles that is not in equilibrium, that doesn't have the ability to correct itself.
Let me see if I can give you a summation that may be a bit simplified, but perhaps it will do for our purposes. I suspect that Augustine's attitude about authority and about Roman civilization would inspire him to respond to my question, the one that I asked you. Why have a unity of authority on civil matters and religious matters whereby the same institution or two branches of the same institution have the authority not only to tell people what to do, but also tell people what to believe? That Augustine would remark, of course, that's normal. That's exactly what I expect. That's exactly what I want. Does that seem a convincing portrayal to you, Bob?
Yeah, you said it more elegantly and simplistically than I did, but that's essentially what I said. It's a fait accompli. I'm finished. I've got them all. I've got not only the narrative, I've got the spiritual side, I've got the religious side, I've got the theological side, in spades, and I've also got the control from the state where I can make anything happen that I want.
Well, that's right. I think in concept, we have to bear in mind in the facts of material circumstances of those days, the Roman state was not all powerful in the sense that the Hitler regime in Germany was all powerful. It did not have the same institutions of communication, of control. It did not have a huge army of people who were able to go from house to house the way the Gestapo could. But the ambition of the Roman state, linked with the ambition of the organized church, was essentially the same. And I believe that Augustine found that quite normal. He believed that this was justified, this was necessary, that this was appropriate. And indeed, that the church and the empire in his day operated in lockstep. They were two branches of the same authority exercised over the individual. And at the time, that authority also included a monopoly on learning and education. So a truly intimidating and frightening combination of cultural, political, and religious circumstances that really were monopolistic in the worst sense. Charles, I'd like to move now to the next page, which is another excerpt from a different kind of reference book, a specialized encyclopedia. And it contains a couple ideas that I think are useful to intensify some of the ideas that we've already discussed about Pelagianism and Pelagius. But I would ask you to read it. These ideas are on page 107 in the large red box. Could you read those two paragraphs, please?
Mm-hmm. Pelagiarism can be constructed from authentic writings. It was a teaching about divine grace, and it hinged on two principles. First, grace comes from man's own choice. Since human free will requires an equipoise before right and wrong, and it is an act of his own that man takes the initiative in salvation. Second, infant baptism is useless, since Adam's sin was personal and therefore does not damn others. The massive attack launched by Augustine was directed against the denial of original sin and the gratuitousness of divine grace. Controversy was clearly conducted without vituperation. Plagiarism and semi-plagiarism are not, however, simply episodes in Christian history. They represent a perennial human response in the search to express the place of human cooperation with grace. In the controversies of the Reformation, as well as within Protestantism and Roman Catholicism, those who have defended human cooperation have been called Pelagians by their adversaries. In preaching, devotional literature, and in the thought of the ordinary Christian, the naturalness of a Pelagian mentality manifests itself. Those who defend the transcendence and gratuitousness of divine grace regard as a practical plagiarism the reduction of the gospel of grace and the Christian life to the level of good behavior, benignly regarded and vaguely assisted by God.
Thank you, Charles. In effect, these two paragraphs explain a fair proportion of the reasons why I believed in Revelation revealed that it was important to treat this subject. In effect, the sentence in the middle of the second paragraph, which I have highlighted in bold, supplies the context. Pelagianism becomes a weapon, an accusation directed against those who, like us, emphasize the ability to make free will choices without being dependent upon an institution, that we as human beings can relate to God directly, and we do not require an active involvement by the group. And so when we started with this question that I explained in the text, that people could accuse the Urantia book of being Pelagianism, we are right here in this campaign of name calling, whereby calling the Urantia book Pelagian then absolves the person making that accusation from the need to study the teachings, the need to explain them, the need to understand them thoroughly, and it simply puts them in a little box of no-nos. The Urantia book is a big no-no because it is Pelagian. And that is the offensive nature of this argument, whereby in certain strands of Christian theology, people on different sides of an argument cast aspersions at their opponents by calling them names. In this case, the name is Pelagian. And in effect, by going through these topics in terms of understanding the ideas, we are giving ourselves an antidote to the accusation that the teachings of the Urantia book are Pelagian. Someone who makes that accusation would consider it dispositive, that having accused the Urantia book of being Pelagian, that solves the question. The person does not have to consider anything further, because after all, Pelagianism was condemned in the early decades of the 5th century. Therefore, there's nothing further that needs to be said. Now, obviously, this is an abuse of reasoning and logic. It's also an abuse of authority. But I believe it's understandable that this kind of accusation could sometime come forth from aficionados of the Roman Catholic and other branches of Christianity, the Roman Catholic tradition and other branches of the Christian tradition, who are looking to the authority of the church to make pronouncements on theological issues, and who would see fit, in effect, to quote a decision of popes who lived in the early decades of the 5th century. Charles, you read the statement, you read the two paragraphs, but now I will ask you, does this concern about the abuse of authority and the abuse of historical principle seem at least something of which we as readers of the Urantia book should be aware of and should be on our guard against?
Well, that's several questions there. We should be aware of it, yes. We should be mindful of it. We shouldn't react with fear or anxiety. What happens to us and how we respond to two different behaviors. And we use Jesus as a model. He never responded fearfully. And we should do the same. We should strive for the same. I have experienced this very thing vis-a-vis with the Urantia book. For instance, I was in the hospital when I was a young man, 1970, for one overnight stay. And a Catholic priest came in and offered his services sincerely and with good cheer. He saw my copy of the Urantia book. This is 1970. By my bedside table in the hospital room. He asked me what it was about, and I summarized it for him in about a minute, some of the highlights of it. When he walked out of the room, he stopped. He cut the tie with me. He came in to talk to me. Not that I'd asked him hospitals to do this as a service. He exited the room by never turning around. He never showed me his back. That happened to a friend of mine, a fellow reader in Hartford, Connecticut. A man had the same sort of thing. He made an inquiry, didn't like what he heard about the Urantia book, and he exited the apartment backwards. It's an old superstition, don't show the devil your back. And I've had individuals who identified the book, who had never read the Urantia book, but identified the book with the workings of the devil. For different aspects of the Urantia book prompted that kind of response in them. That, I think, is no different than what we're talking about 1,500 years ago, approximately. It's the same issue. And I think you're right. It's to have a disparaging language. It can be used as a weapon, for sure. All tyrants have done that to greater or lesser extent. You do it by degrading the definition and identifying a group or a person of that group by a key phrase or term or word. That's disparaging. And that becomes a norm. You make it into a norm, not simply, so I'm not talking about a lesson in grammar and spelling, and it's much more, it's much grimmer than that. It has to do with shorthand, kind of political or moral, social or racial shorthand. And it's very widespread. It's been done for a long, long time by all across the world. There are lots of examples of it. The printing of books has not stopped it at all. It just makes that particular technique more widespread. Same thing, ditto with radio and television and the internet. Look at the people that complain about social media. Well, you wrote this and you're that, therefore, whatever that happens to be. A very common technique, disparagement. And it's a way of breaking down the legitimacy of a group or a person in that group. And it's quite effective in the short term, in the material sense. It has different aspects to it, but in terms of how we're going to respond as students in the Urantia book, I don't argue. I have certain techniques I've developed. One of them is I don't argue religion. I'll argue science, history, or politics, but not religion. I'll discuss religion. What I do generally, I really have two answers. One very detailed, which I'm not going to give now. I'll hold that for later, because you raised the question again on page 109, I think. Yes, 109. And you raised it earlier. Generally, I employ skills that I developed and honed as a classroom teacher. They essentially can be summarized as the art of listening, that's first and foremost. Listening is an active behavior with mind, with the intellect and emotions. The art of listening, and then a conversation. I foster conversation, and sometimes that's not possible because the other person refuses to allow me to speak, or refuses to engage in a conversation. And in that particular case, at the earliest moment where it's socially graceful, I excuse myself and leave. Now, I think I'm quite capable of destroying, intellectually speaking, the argument of such individuals. They're very flimsy in terms of reason and knowledge. They're very flimsy. They won't hold up. Bias, bigotry, prejudice, propaganda are all flimsy in terms of the rule of reason. However, there's something larger at stake, and he is loved by God just the same as I am, he or she, although they generally are men, not women, generally, curiously. There are certain behaviors that I've, in my experience, the 50-some-odd years in the Rancher book, that more common with men than women, curiously. That's another conversation, but I think it's not just a coincidence. I think there's something else going on even there. And in the Protestant, it's interesting that, and I'll close with this observation, the United States of America stands, if it stands for anything, it stands for human liberty. Why the French built and gave us the Statue of Liberty. Liberty Enlightening the World is our actual name. In 1886, it was erected. Well, it's interesting that in the United States Constitution, in the First Amendment, which describes 6 rights, 2 of them have to do with church and state, the union of church and state, and require the separation of that union. That we regarded that as fundamental, as foundational to the creation of a democratic republic. That's what we actually are. We're a republic that's managed through a democratic means. We're not just a democracy, we're a republic. But this issue that we're talking about this afternoon is fundamental, I think, even to human happiness, peace, security, safety. And in the Declaration of Independence, the American Declaration of Independence, the pursuit of happiness is explicitly referenced. I mean happiness in that sense. And it's crucial that if individuals are to grow beyond certain levels, that they are free to do so, in my view. But establishments, power structures of any kind, political, economic, moral, religious, so forth, scientific, so forth, and so educational, power structures do tend to become stuck, as they say in Washington, D.C., in a bubble of their own making. Goes back to the chosen person syndrome, or chosen people syndrome, that you have a special legitimacy. And so to call somebody, to take the word of take a man's name, Pelagius, and then convert it into a noun, another noun, and then attach disparaging meaning to it so that it becomes commonplace, at least in certain groups, and make that into a norm of society, would be a very effective way to crush, at least in the material sense, at least in the short-term sense, maybe not so short, but in a material sense, crush a group of individuals who are trying to assert their own liberty, their own free will, and their own personal responsibility. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. I agree with you, Charles, that this technique of name calling and identifying opponents by virtue of a word or two that may relate to a personal name or the name of a previous institution or movement is pervasive. We see it in American politics these days. Twitter, for example, is a source of the extremely disruptive and dismissive comments by political opponents who call each other names. And so the prospect of the attack Pelagianism by someone who is an aficionado of Christian theory and Christian history is not something new as an example of behavior in the world. And I certainly agree with you, Charles, that we should not be afraid of it. My content here is that we should be prepared for it and should have a reasonable answer, if possible, in a friendly and considerate way that avoids attacking the person who makes the statement. But your example of someone who came into your hotel room and then refused to turn around for the sake of not identifying his back to you because of concern that you were an evil influence, I suppose does happen. I suppose some people do believe it, but it strikes me as an extreme example of personal prejudice.
Well, it would. Actually, it was in the hospital, and this priest, in my case, exited my room and was my friend of mine, who was a long-standing student of the book that it happened to. The same thing happened, exact same behavior occurred. It is an extreme example. Nonetheless, it was done, but it was not something that was coincidental, in my opinion. If you have someone who is obstreperous, if their bias becomes outspoken, and you want to maintain some kind of connection, at least for a while, the only method that may work is questioning. In other words, when the person opens up to the page 920 or 921 in the race papers, and then quotes or paraphrases a statement about the different races, evolutionary races, or that Mary is not a virgin, references that, or any number of points in the Urantia book. The best, if you're not going to leave, then the best way to respond is through raising a question, making a question. A question tends to be disarming to a certain degree, and the least threatening expression. On the other hand, if you strongly assert, boldly assert, they will probably hear that as a counterattack. And if the person has strength of character, they will go after you. And I've had the opportunity to deal with a number of individuals in a variety of settings. Sometimes, however, and at the same time as you raise a question, you should pray. Again, not in fear, but for clarity to your indwelling divine spirit, for assistance and calmness, to remain calm if need be. One example that's interesting, some things the actions are ours, but the consequences are God's. They teach that in the mansion worlds. We should heed that. I do. I practice that axiom, of a number of axioms I derive from the book. I had a neighbor of mine, 2 houses down when I lived in Connecticut, and he came one afternoon and he read in the magazine, reference to the Urantia book, concerning thought adjusters. He assumed they were Orwellian, that they controlled your mind in terms of power, material power, etc., etc. And I said to him, "You're misinterpreting it." He was not uptight. But he was dogged, and it came out of the blue, from my point of view. And but I welcomed him in my house, and we talked for about 15 minutes, and he left. About a year later, he came back and he said to me, "You're right. I read what I said a year ago. Remember what I said?" I said, "Yes, I do. I read what I remember what you said about it, and I did read the Urantia book's papers on the thought adjustment. It's not what this writer had said." So he apologized. I told him it wasn't necessary to apologize, but he, on his own, perhaps with the Spirit of truth, perhaps on his own, he came to me and he explained that. So when we're dealing with other persons who have no intention to read it or to read the whole book, or who at least have not yet read it, we should realize that help comes unbidden. We're not doing this. We're working in a context, in a context of the living Spirit, the Spirit of truth. Each of us has a Father fragment, a Father Spirit, the Master Seraphim, and perhaps others, to work alongside us, to work with us. And that should be integral to our prayer life as well as our thinking in regard to presenting or responding to the content of the Urantia book. I just offer that as a suggestion based on that experience and similar experiences.
I appreciate what you've just said, Charles, and I think if I have to pull out one key bit of advice that you're providing, it has to do with distinguishing a conversation in which people are willing to examine issues rationally and perhaps with a degree of respect for the other person, as opposed to a situation in which a person is essentially interested in condemning and closing discussion by applying a name, by calling names. And in the latter circumstances, most of the time, discussion will not be profitable, and it may simply be best, as you have suggested, to react to that by asking questions that are at least possibly a way of drawing out the other person. Bob, would you like to comment on this discussion concerning the ways of answering an accusation?
Yes, thanks, Neil. Charles, great points. Great points. I'm going to follow up on a couple of them. One thing that seems to be going on here, Neil, is that if this hypothetical situation where either a theologian or an aficionado, and I want to distinguish those in a second here, we're using Pelagianism as a weapon against the Urantia book and the cosmology and true teachings of Jesus in there. I'm not sure what the right answer is. I like what Charles said, that we should be aware of this idea of Pelagianism, and basically what it is. It's the understanding of, it's the difference in degree, not in kind, of grace, free will, baptism, original sin, and derivatives like potentially atonement that may be a derivative, or it may be the driver of this. I'm not exactly sure which is the chicken or the egg on that one. But I'm saying that Pelagianism is a difference from current conventional doctrine that came off of Augustine at the time, which is apparent that you could see why Christianity was developed as an extemporaneous religion after that, or theology. The theology of it built all kinds of derivative concepts because it had to. It had to try and explain. It's almost like a lie. You tell a lie and you have to tell another one to try to make up for the one you just made, and you never know what's going on. That's why it doesn't work. It's always best to tell the truth. Well, in this situation, it's a similar situation. So I don't know what the right answer is, but I do know that my thought pattern went to this hypothetical situation as Urantia, the papers in total is not Christianity 2.0. Pelagianism is Christianity 1.5. If I can make an analogy here of software, if the development of Christianity was Christianity 1.0 before the Dark Ages, then Pelagian, being that it's only a difference in degree, not in kind, then we're talking it's software release 1.5, so to speak. It's Christianity 1.5, just a different way to approach grace. But then you get to the Urantia book, and you get to the cosmic consciousness and the cosmology, and the depth of of the grand universe, and in fact the master universe. And we're not talking that it's a Christianity 2.0. It's sure there's some parts of Christianity that will immortalize it, and those need to be embellished and worked upon because we're dealing with evolutionary religion, and it's here, and it's important to leaven Christianity rather than, or leaven all the world's religions and philosophies rather than push them down. So I'd start with that as my approach. Each of the context of how the weaponization occurs would probably require a slightly different approach. I like the idea of being didactic or asking questions. That's probably the best thing to do to create a dialogue. You have to create a dialogue. But anyone that's steeped in the doctrine is not going to move on to the next one. Now, there may be a difference in your hypothetical situation of a theologian and an aficionado, because I had to look up what the word aficionado means. You use so many high register words here, Neil, that you send me to the dictionary most of the time. First of all, in the question, an epithet is a label, opprobrium is scorn, and ignominy is humiliation, and of course you used shame, which is pretty much dishonor. That's if someone's trying to do that. Augustine did that to Pelagius for sure.
Yes,
all of those was the approach that he used to gain control over the ideas. I would have to think that, and as I said a minute ago, that each of the conditions, if it's a theologian, then hopefully the theologian has, some kind of intellectual basis by which, you could be, start to build the dialogue. Charles's story was very interesting with, the priest, I guess it was Charles, turning his back. Well, there's not much you're going to do about that. With the aficionado, an aficionado is a fanatical devotee of some belief. So I would assume that that's a slightly different approach, and maybe the aficionado knows a little bit about Pelagianism, and hopefully from this lesson and from what we're providing our listeners is a little bit more depth to what the differences are between conventional Christianity and the heresy in quotation marks of Pelagianism. I would think, I wouldn't say this, but I would think pretty much what in the same way Jesus said to Peter and James when they said, after they got their training done and they kind of jumped ahead and, with all the zeal of their new training. And they said, let's go forth and take the kingdom. And Jesus said, may your wisdom equal your zeal and your courage atone for your ignorance. That's kind of how I would approach the aficionado. Not saying that, of course, but in some ways to try and understand the zeal, where maybe the aspect of wisdom, because the system itself is not allowing wisdom to operate. Doctrine and doctrinaire suppress the adjutant of wisdom to operate in the individual. So there's nothing but zeal, and I think that's probably what we've seen for the last 300 or 400 or 500 years when Gutenberg finally took over and communication became somewhat ubiquitous until now, when it's just exponentially ubiquitous. So that's my approach to it, and I'll turn it back to you, Neil.
Thank you. I would comment on the word aficionado, which of course comes from my text, but state that it is not necessarily a negative attribute. For example, one can say that someone is an aficionado of Italian opera, someone who is deeply interested and attracted to and a devotee of, in this case, Italian opera. But I suppose that your comments on my vocabulary leave the net implication that I'm trying to make you an aficionado of dictionaries. And maybe that's a side effect of my writing.
Oh, for sure. It's a side effect. Absolutely. I have to count on that.
All right. Now, I would like to provide a little bit of interesting information about a person who is not with us today. After our discussion on Saturday of last week, the 20th, Stephen Hecht expressed his regret that he would not be able to join us today, as he has not. He had a contrary engagement that was obliging him to refrain from being with us. But he also gave me comments from his perspective, his understanding, and his research into Pelagius. Stephen stated that he had reviewed a particular book that is in his library, a book called Pelagius Inquiries and Reappraisals by Robert F. Evans. And he gave me certain impressions of his about Pelagius based on what he had read in that book. So let me read part of one email message that Stephen sent to me. He stated, and this is now coming from Stephen, according to Pelagius, grace of creation is nothing more or less than the gift of our rational free will, that we are able to make genuinely free will choices, not that we produce grace by our choice. Pelagius states that we can conform to and reinforce God's grace through our free will choice by refusing to sin in any and all of our actions. The grace of free will choice confers the possibility of the perfectibility of human nature in the light of God's love. Then I'm still reading from Stephen's paragraph. He states, Augustine hated that idea. Augustine hated the idea that we can become perfect through the grace of free will choices in the light of God's love. Now, to us, thank you, I finished the quotation from Stephen's email message to me, but I would now like to ask Doreen to react to the idea that we can become perfect through the grace of our free will choices, and then at the same time, why Augustine might have objected to that.
Well, thank you. First of all, his thinking, he saw human nature as, it's deeply wounded, corrupted, disordered, changed, mutable, born guilty and selfish and falling from grace as a result of Adam's first sin. And as a result of that, sin, the human race is utterly condemned, incapable of saving itself, yet not without hope. So human nature, being what it is, I didn't understand, because if we're created in the image of God or the likeness of God, I guess we're not that tarnished as he describes. So, I was thinking, I know that if God, gave us the free will, and he never imposes on us any submission to him. It said he allows us to find him, to recognize, love, and worship him. And this is all done voluntarily. So evil and sin are inevitable, I guess, the Urantia book says, if we are to remain truly free. But the understanding how you cut off thinking, and one of the things I came across, which I thought was so interesting, that Augustine said, he says, there is another form of temptation, more dangerous, the disease of curiosity. Now, I mean, what does that tell you about his thinking? He said, you try to discover the secret of nature, which are beyond our understanding, and avail us nothing which man should not wish to learn. and that was, they said he was a great influence, of course, on Calvin. So I don't understand, maybe this was a time where the Roman Empire was falling apart, and I don't know what he was trying to hold on, but it certainly, Pelagianism certainly ruled his entire life because it never ended for him, and he constantly had to defend it. So, you know, his influence, I guess, on Orthodox Christianity for the most, you know, was in the most of the Middle Ages. But you have to ask the question, well, what was, you know, the original sin, and how did they pass it on? And are we guilty of all these terrible things? Well, as far as we know, you know, no person is ever made, you know, to be condemned because of, to suffer, you know, spiritual deprivation, I suppose, because of the sin of anyone else. And I can't understand this whole idea about this doctrine of original sin and we're punished forever. How could then we ever achieve this free will understanding that God gave us, and through Jesus' spirit of truth? You have all this written, and I really could not connect all the dots to see why he said all these things if he read the Bible, I guess as it was written then, I'm not quite sure, and not understanding it.
It's a great mystery too. I think your point about not inquiring, about curiosity in Augustine's view itself being an evil, could be perhaps summarized, or if you wish, caricaturized by, don't think about anything that I haven't told you to think about, and don't even think about thinking about anything that I haven't told you to think about.
Right.
So this is a tyranny of the mind. In addition to being a tyranny of the spirit, it is the assumption of authority over all thought. And it effectively circumscribes human volition into obedience to a particular set of authority figures who are identified with what Augustine believes is right, at the same time with whom Augustine believes that truth is assigned to them and that obedience is required of all others. This is not a human doctrine, or perhaps I should say, it is only perversely a human doctrine. It certainly does not respect the dignity of individual humans as children of God. It makes us puppets from that perspective.
Yeah. So
go ahead, Doreen.
Well, I was saying, you know, perhaps the Roman Catholic Church had to unify, you know, all the different areas of their empire. That and this was a way to unify the teachings, to tell, you know, one message, and everybody follow this doctrine. And don't think for yourself. Of course, that's what that's why people go and listen to somebody in authority, and you're supposed to repeat what they said, and that's what you believe, and you don't question. And that's all religion, mind you. I don't just condemn the Catholic Church. I heard it from other people of different denominations that don't, because they don't have answers for them. And that's why. If you can't answer something, you put it down, or you tell them, you know, not to ask the questions, or you call names, which you professed to talk about earlier. And only, I have to just follow up with what Charles said. It reminded me of a story when I was in Brazil sitting in an airport, and I took the book, I just had gotten the book, and I took it with me on this trip into the Amazon, and waiting for a plane to go to Peru. And there was a whole bunch of missionaries sitting next to me. And they just had come out of the jungle trying to Christianize the savages, they told me. And I asked them some questions. We began talking, and then I said, well, how about I opened up to some page in the Urantia, and this is like 82 or whatever. And he took it and he's reading it, and he, maybe 5-10 minutes later, he took the book, threw it up in the air, mind you, in front of everyone, and yelled, "This is the work of the devil." My husband he was far away from me anyway. He knew this was going to happen. But you see this lack of insight, and they don't want to have insight. After all, it means effort and struggle and thinking and questioning, and maybe there is something you could be learned from it.
I hear you, and I appreciate that additional example, that additional story you have told. To me, it more or less correlates with a fairly colloquial statement that nevertheless captures a certain reality. The statement goes as follows, quote, "I know what I believe, don't confuse me with the truth," unquote. And some people have that view, that they are not willing to consider anything but what they are convinced is right, and they believe that any statement to the contrary is inherently evil, or in the vein of your story, is coming from the devil.
Yeah. One more thing, Neil. And, Easter Sunday, I decided to stay home, and I went out to just get a coffee in one of the shops a couple of blocks from here. And there was 2 Chinese young men sitting outside, and I was drinking my coffee. They came by, and I asked them, I like to engage people, so I started to talk to them. And it was interesting, because I had been in China, and, we discussed, and all the things that I had experienced was before they were born, so they could not relate to any of it. But the interesting thing, so I asked them at the end, it was a good discussion, about a half hour. They all worked for Google, the both of them. They have PhDs, very bright young men. So for just as a side thing to say, he told me all the people that work for Google are foreigners. So maybe that's why you have a lot of acronyms now. I don't know. They come up with all these things. He said and that's why they really get along well. But I asked them if they believe in anything. Do they believe in a higher power? Do they believe in God? And of course, growing up in a communist system, they only believed in materialism and science. And he said, so I asked them, okay, well, we talked a bit about science, but I said, well, could you prove love? Is there any way that science could indicate in their mathematical formulas about love? And it stumped them. They had no answer for me. And they said, well, maybe someday science will come up with that too. But they were just delightful. And it's fresh to talk to young people in their 20s that are good thinkers. But when you're closed, there is no way, to try to bother to influence us. When you grow up and get married and have kids, you'll have a better understanding of life. And that was my story.
Thank you, Doreen. That's an interesting additional story, and I appreciate it. I would just comment on one aspect that you brought up. You implied that perhaps foreigners are the champions at inventing acronyms. I do not believe so. I believe that Americans are the champions at inventing acronyms, with a special mention of the propensity to do that among defense people and also among computer gurus. Both of those particular categories of humanity seem to be intensively addicted to acronyms. And I see Bob smiling, so I'm not going to ask him to react.
Okay.
Instead, I would like to go on myself to the top of page 108 and read the first 2 paragraphs at the top of that page, which follow the heading analysis. These 2 paragraphs are my attempt to bring together some of the points that we have indeed discussed. It follows analysis. Pelagius appears to have been an austere figure who may also have been puritanical. But we agree with him that human nature is fundamentally good, that human beings are free to choose between good and evil, and that sin occurs only by deliberate choice, not as a consequence of another person's actions at some previous moment. In other words, we agree with Celestius and other followers of Pelagius that the doctrine of original sin is a myth, that infants are not born with some imaginary stain, and that initiating a sound and favorable relationship with God does not require baptism or any other ceremony carried out by some representative of institutional religion. Now, I think fairly enough that these two paragraphs do sum up much of what we have discussed. And so I am not going to ask each of you to comment, but I'm going to offer the opportunity for any of you who wishes to comment to bring forward those remarks now.
Okay, so, well,
Was that a request for the floor, or are you mulling over whether you wish to request the floor? All right, I do not hear any immediate requests to speak on this, and I take
Well,
it.
I'm
Right.
just thinking about it.
All right, Charles, go ahead.
The definition of evil in the Urantia book is, I find, quite interesting. Essentially, it's error or potential for error. With that definition in mind, I think evil is inevitable. That is to say, error would be inevitable. I don't think sin is inevitable, though. And I think it's because of free will that it's not inevitable. You can't sin by mistake or by accident or out of ignorance. You can only sin. You can commit evil, using the book's definition, by such means, but not sin. We should keep this in mind. Sin is the byproduct of knowing the will of God and then deliberately transgressing that will. And I think these, as far as the Urantia book is concerned, these distinctions should be kept in mind. And a number of implications stem from them, but I won't go into those. I was charmed by the repetition of the statement. I got up to get another phone, a stronger battery, that human nature is essentially good. My favorite Chinese philosopher is Mencius, and he taught that. And he said, if any person, adult person, who would go by a well and see a small child sitting on the well and is about to fall in, but that adult had the opportunity, for sure, if so acted upon, to save that child's life, would save the child. And the strength of that, in similar stories, he postulated the inherent goodness of people. Jesus, to my sense, thought that people were more troubled than cause trouble. Speaking very, very broadly as I can, of humanity. And any theology that would include that in its premise, I think, has something important to offer. Just a few thoughts.
Thank you, Charles. I think we have come to a logical conclusion of this. I do believe that those two paragraphs highlighted certain elements that all of us have been discussing. And therefore, I would like now to go on to the interpretation, the comments, the analysis that starts in the middle of the page, wherein the text explains that the argument with Pelagius led Augustine to even more extreme views that can correctly be understood as predestination. So here I go. I'm going to read those 3 paragraphs in the middle of the page. A side effect and its appalling implications. During Augustine's extended struggle with Pelagius and Pelagianism, his views on how God bestows grace became increasingly restrictive. He ended up proclaiming that God has made arbitrary decisions, that some persons will be saved and that others will not. According to Augustine, God made such decisions before time began, and therefore before any individual was born. These repulsive teachings most assuredly amount to predestination. They clearly influenced John Calvin, and through him, the entire spectrum of evangelical thought among Protestant Christians. One well-respected historian describes how Augustine's views evolved while he was crusading against Pelagius and his followers. And now we have an excerpt from a book called Christianity, the First 3,000 Years by Diarmaid MacCulloch. Bob, would you read that quotation that appears in the box with the red frame, please?
Sure, Neil. It starts. In the process, Augustine's thoughts about the nature of grace and salvation were pushed to ever more extreme positions, which can be traced both through the City of God, and which is in italicized, is the name of the work, and the long series of tracts, which he wrote attacking Pelagian thought. Eventually, he could say not simply that all human impulses to do good are a result of God's grace, but that it is an entirely arbitrary decision on the part of God as to who receives this grace. God has made the decision before all time, so some are foreordained to be saved through grace, a predestined group of the elect. The arbitrariness is fully justified by the monstrousness of Adam's original fall, in which we all have a part through original sin. There was much criticism of this theology of grace at the time, and it has alternately repelled and fascinated both Catholic and Protestants down to the present day. Eastern theologians, so influenced by the Eastern monastic tradition of spiritual endeavor, which encompasses both Chalcedonians and non-Chalcedonians, have never found Augustine's approach to grace congenial.
Thank you. We have, in effect, not only a story with historical content, but a story with practical implications today. The teachings of John Calvin and his followers in evangelical Christianity amount to asserting that some believers are destined to be saved and that others are destined to be damned, not to be saved, and that the task really is to discover which category you personally fall into, because according to this analytical view, you cannot do anything about it. God has already chosen this. God has already made that decision about you. Now, I must say that this is repulsive. I think it's just as repulsive as the statements attributed to Augustine. But my question to you, since I know I am speaking to colleagues who have views that are far more attuned to the teachings of the Urantia book than to this paragraph of history, how the idea that God has preordained some people to be punished for eternity, and has done that even before they are born, can be reconciled with the idea that God is a loving Father. How is it possible to harmonize those two viewpoints? They seem to be contradictory. Charles, would you take that?
They are contradictory. They're manifestly contradictory. The concept of original sin dims spiritual light. That's its most unfortunate effect. In my view, it's unjust, it's unfair, and it's dark. It cannot be squared with a fatherly attitude. I'm a father of two sons, and they're in their late 40s. I enjoy the approbation of both of them. I've taught about 4,000 students, and I've seen the effects of good fathers and bad fathers in high school kids, ages 14 to 18. The fatherly attitude is, a good fatherly attitude is loving and protective. It disciplines, yes, but it primarily is loving. And when a person is loved, that is to say, they're valued for their own sake, not so much for what they do, but they're valued for their own personhood. They're much more secure as persons, as adults. I've taught dozens and dozens and dozens of kids whom I knew, whose parents I knew. So I saw both generations many, many times over. And it was repeated. I know whereof I speak because I saw it and heard it directly. It's not a fatherly attitude, which values the fruits of the Spirit, as are listed by Jesus on page 2054 in the Rancher book. Single column, as some might say. But it's a matter of justice, original sin. It's a matter of fairness, and it's dark. It's contrary to light. It's, in a spiritual sense, it's literally dark. If sin is defined as the knowledgeable, knowing, deliberate transgression of the will of God, it cannot work. Original sin simply cannot work. I don't know how else to define sin, unless you want to say it's a mistake, but then that changes everything. If we sin by mistake, we're doomed, because we're the most imperfect species, intelligent species in the universe, time and space. Secondly, it creates a faulty causality, faulty causation. It distorts reality through that means, the faulty causality. It contradicts the personality endowment, which includes free will. It assigns blame with little or no hope of redemption. We are born, we live, we die with a cloud over us, a moral and spiritual cloud over us. When I was 10 years old, as you know, I rejected it. 66 years later, I still reject it. It disrupts the straight line that can be drawn, personal line, between you and God's love in you, receiving God's love. It doesn't disrupt God's love, but that line, that connection is disrupted. For all those reasons, and no doubt more, it demeans the very concept of the universal, of the Father, as a paradise deity, as a universal Father. And so you use the adjective appalling in your subtitle. I would say dreadful, to be dreaded. And yet it's widely subscribed to. We've talked somewhat about that. Nonetheless, I rejected whole cloth for the reasons primarily for the reasons I've given. I thank you for the opportunity to state that.
Thank you, Charles. I certainly assure you that I was not in any doubt, but your remarks are indeed very resonant and very important and very appealing. Now, you remarked that original sin causes us, by implication, to live under a cloud. And I would now like to turn to my colleague who appears to enjoy living under a cloud, even though it may just be the IBM cloud or the Google cloud or even the Dreamweaver cloud. So perhaps he will react to that element or anything else in my question or your reply.
Very good, Neil. Very good. I'm always in the cloud. A couple of quick thoughts. I know we're running up, against our time here. This whole idea of grace is quite interesting, and I do want to say that the Urantia papers provide multiple instances, as they do with faith, with the term faith, with the term religion, with the term providence, which is even much larger, and provide a cosmic dimension for these terms. It seems as though, and this is why I said earlier that the Pelagianism is a difference in degree but not in kind. The Urantia papers provide us the cosmic depth of this term grace, so that it's different in kind. I went to the dictionary just to see where the definition of grace would actually show in conventional thought here. And I've got Thorndike Barnhart from 1964, so I tried to go back as far as I could. And it's extensive. Grace has to do well, let me just read the one for theology, which is pretty much on conventional wisdom. It's God's free and undeserved favor to and love for mankind, influence of God operating in man to improve and strengthen. Every time that I read the Urantia Papers and I look at the context by which the term grace is being used, it covers a lot of these areas. You know, there's a grace period, for example. Grace could be given a time dimension. Graciousness, gracefulness, all apply to an individual. And you know, not to get into too much depth, because I just want to make the general statement that grace seems to be a quality of the condition of the the three cosmic intuitions that we have, as well as the ability of our free will to make decisions. The idea, I think this is an entire effort that saving through grace, for example, is what I just marked in that little area that I read. The entire objective, I should say, of the early Christianity one percenters tried to do is to develop this idea so that control could happen. And Pelagius, in some ways, even though it was a difference in degree, did turn that around a little bit, which is probably why it was considered heresy at the time. But with the cosmic dimension, I think we're going to find that it's an entirely different aspect of life. Back to you, Nick.
Thank you, Bob. Your reference to grace and the definition you've given reminds me of the extremely well-known Christian hymn called Amazing Grace. Mm-hmm. And even though that hymn is very moving and has many positive elements, it is also tangled up with the idea of salvation and redemption from sin through the death of Jesus on the cross. And so even though we can commend the spiritual impetus for the hymn Amazing Grace, it is connected with this theology of salvation and redemption through death of Jesus, and that it's very, very hard to commend that hymn because of the theological associations. Now, as a contrast, I remember the 20th century comedy team of George Burns and Gracie Allen. And George Burns had a slight difference on that title. He used to say, Amazing Gracie. And of course, Gracie was his wife and the other half of the comedy team. I remember a recipe of Gracie's for deciding how long to cook a turkey. And it went like this. You buy one small turkey and one large turkey. And when the small one burns, then the large one is ready. So I would guess that does justify the phrase Amazing Gracie. Doreen, I saw you smile. Was that just because it was amusing or because you wanted to contribute additional thoughts?
Yeah, I wanted to just close with something in the Urantia book that said, what must I do to be saved? And it's just Jesus's closing remarks. And it says, in summing up his final statement, he said, you cannot buy salvation. You cannot earn righteousness. Salvation is the gift of God, and righteousness is the natural fruit of the spirit-born life of sonship in the kingdom. You are not to be saved because you live a righteous life. Rather, it is that you live a righteous life because you have already been saved. Have recognized sonship as a gift of God and service in the kingdom as the supreme delight of life on earth. When men believe this gospel, which is a revelation of the goodness of God, they will be led to voluntarily repentance of all known sin. Realization of sonship is compatible with the desire to sin, is incompatible, I'm sorry. Kingdom believers hunger for righteousness and thirst for divine perfection. And that's why you can come back to that, how, to the idea of plagiarism. If people attack you, you can't convince anybody of anything. You really have to hunger for truth. You have to want to know. And so many people are shut down and really just, they don't, they're lazy in their thinking. But I thought that was just such a lovely summation, of that sin and saving grace.
Thank you very much, Doreen. I agree with you. I am now going to turn to the formal question 66, that appears at the top of page 109, and I will read it, even though I think that for many purposes, we have, all of us, already given answers to that question. But the question reads as follows: 66. How would you respond if a theologian or some other aficionado of Christian doctrine and history were to assert that the Urantia book is Pelagian, on the understanding that he or she intended that epithet as a badge of opprobrium, ignominy, and shame, and was wielding it as an all too convenient excuse that dispensed him or her from making the effort to analyze the teachings in substance and discuss them in detail? Now, in most of our programs, I have asked each of the participants in one of our webinars, to address a formal question like this. I am not going to do that in this case because I believe that in large measure we have already exchanged answers on this point, but I will offer anyone who wishes to add additional thoughts on this question the opportunity to do so. If you wish to speak, please signify that.
Well, I do, but we've really run out of time, and I have a more. I've responded generally, but I have some. There are specifics I think I'd like to make to those generalities.
Well, I would like you to
would you object to doing it next week?
I would prefer that you go ahead now, because we will be in a different mood next week.
All right. First of all, I have two questions I would raise. Why would God make his children cosmic captives? And is God a universal warden or universe warden in this regard? No good father would ever do this to his children. The Urantia book teaches spiritual liberty and joy, purpose. And it also teaches that we, with the Supreme, contribute to the fabric of universe reality in time and space. It does both. And all four parts, one way or another, come down to that. Jesus lived accordingly. And that's why his faith may be characterized as a living faith. The proper assignment to humanity of moral and spiritual responsibility fosters hope. It fosters hope in the human heart and soul. If you take that away and you put barriers, you begin to treat the individual as a criminal might be treated. We are brothers and sisters to each other in spiritual terms, literally brothers and sisters, because we have a common Father and we are his children in the same family. Elements of what Pelagius has taught could be generalized and transferred to the notion that the universe is better understood in the family model, by the family model, not by the kingdom model. And that is why it's fair to expect mortals to grow, because they do have free will, and they do have a responsibility attached to that free will to live according to their highest light, not their greatest fear. I place a very high value on liberty and joy and purpose. The idea of enlightenment and sense of humor and a mission is essential in the art of living, to the art of living. Now, his pledges, his puritanical things are his own shtick. I don't share those. You don't need pain or suffering or that kind of physical discipline to find God. You do need faith, though. And it's no small matter that the three keys to the kingdom of heaven are sincerity, more sincerity, and more sincerity. But the capacity to grow depends on decision making, which itself is the very essence of living responsibly. And because we're equipped, that is a universe I want to be a part of. I want to continue being a part of. Because it is fair, it is just, and it's something that fosters and promotes light, not darkness. And I'm grateful to God to be invited to this universe, to remain with this universe. I still hold that the most remarkable, in my opinion, the most remarkable arrangement, at least in the universes of super universe of time and space, the grand universe, of having a perfect paradise spirit indwell in the most imperfect human mind with the potential to fuse is amazing and remarkable and fair and just and joyful, because we have a say-so in this, and we have a part to play. We have a responsibility. We are the personality, expectation, possibility for the paradise spirit, the thought adjuster. The thought adjuster is the eternity possibility for us. And that's fair and balanced and reasonable and doable. And it's amazing. It's beautiful. And it's amazing. It's not incredible. It's very credible. I believe it's very credible. It's what a good father would do. That's the behavior of a good father. That's the way a family is run. A good father provides. The providence of God is the provision of His grace, manifested as the fruits of the Spirit. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Charles. These remarks were very inspiring. I think you have provided us with a much wider context than merely this conversation with a theologian. But I believe that everything you have said is important and worthwhile in understanding that we are the children of a loving Father, and that His intentions for us are positive and constructive, certainly not aimed or intended to develop some kind of punishment that lies in wait if we are unwary or uncareful. In any event, I thank all of you for being very careful, for being wary, for perhaps reacting to my comments and occasional jokes with a certain degree of caution. And I've enjoyed our discussion today. I certainly look forward to another exciting or perhaps interesting discussion next week. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Bye, Neil. Bye, everybody.
Adios.